Well, Daniel, he holds a PhD in architecture from the Polytechnic University in Madrid. And his PhD thesis was on a very interesting topic, housing and revolution. And so he finished in 2015, I guess, was it? 16. And then Daniel came to Sweden to teach at, or is now currently teaching at Umeå School of Architecture, which I think is also one of the partners in the project, right? I saw the Umeå logo there in the research project by Eva. And so Daniel has been his research is pretty much focused on housing design, but also how housing is a special social and political phenomenon. And he has published a book, which I guess that all of the students should read, of course, and all of us as well, because it's the 99 years of the housing question in Sweden, which was published in 2017. And this indeed sort of presents an overview of the history of modern architecture in Swedish housing. And so I guess that's well, enough for the presentation. We look forward now to your talk, which has an intriguing. Is it a Swedish name? Hemmet?
Yeah.
Okay, so the home. Okay, sure, of course. So welcome, Daniel, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks to everyone, to the familiar faces, and also thanks to the new faces for making this dialogue possible. I'm very grateful for being part of this, and also grateful for being in southern Sweden, or at least, I come from the winter, so Umeå, right? And last week we were with the students in Kiruna, which is very far north in Sweden, and that was like even more winter. So for me this is kind of a trip to the end of the summer. For the next 10 to 15 minutes, I will attempt to track the paradigm shift in Swedish housing policies that occurred following the Second World War. I will explore the evolution of the discourse that has shaped the core image of what we call the Swedish model, from selective policies that eventually resulted in disregard of individual rights to a more inclusive democratic understanding of housing politics that focus on the inclusive potential of the welfare state. Sweden entered the second half of the 20th century as a model of democracy in a world that had been profoundly shaken by war. Sweden's neutrality during the Second World War shielded it against international conflicts, and both enabled and promoted collective thinking in the country. In addition, the success of regulations enacted during the war years steered it towards an entirely different direction. Between 1936 and 1945, the social democratic government's attempts to improve housing standards were frustrated by shortages in the civil construction industry. In 1942, the approval of Hyresregleringslagen, the Rent Regulation Act, kept rents at an affordable level for workers and guaranteed their tenure. However, this measure was insufficient. The reminiscence of the economic crisis that followed the First World War haunted politicians and led them to favor a planned economy for Sweden. As a result, in 1944, the government adopted the post-war labor movement program. It represented a new roadmap for the country, increasing state intervention and in structural issues such as employment, industrial policy, and wealth distribution. The housing question and its potential consequences, such as improvement in living standards, were thus integrated into an ambitious planned economy program. The ideological foundations of housing policies had already been established during the interwar years, and it was during the post-war period that the first great efforts were made towards making it a reality. Whilst the most significant and highly regarded housing advances in Europe were paralyzed during the war, Sweden was able to carry on striving to improve the living conditions of its workers. However, it did not limit itself to this task. It sought to take these conceptions to unprecedented levels of social well-being. Bostadssocialutredningen, the National Commission on Social Housing, created in 1933, presented its final reports between 1946 and 1947, setting out the general outlines for a future housing policy and establishing a system of public housing loans. In 1947, Parliament adopted the recommendations of this commission and ended housing policies that exclusively targeted low-income social groups, identified in Sweden with barnrikehus. From that moment onwards, housing, a right of every citizen and a common good that the state had to guarantee, was conceived as a service for the population, regardless of people's social background. Riksdagen's change of direction had far-reaching consequences and represented an unprecedented advance in the development of housing policies. For the first time, the historical boundaries that separated housing for the rich and the poor were to be blurred. This new direction was an attempt to attain high housing standards for all citizens, without exception, and if this objective was met, slum areas where the low-income population lived would be consigned to history. Consequently, Parliament adopted a strategy that involved acting simultaneously on three fronts. First, to facilitate subsidies to low-income households with children and to pensioners. Second, to implement an ambitious loan program to promote housing building. And finally, to continue housing research to build high-quality housing at affordable prices. Access to good quality housing for low-income groups was guaranteed through subsidies. Moreover, good quality housing was no longer understood to be simply accommodation that enabled access to a minimum set of services. It now implied dwellings that allowed people to live there, their lives to the full. That is to say, substantially improve their quality of life. In a country where it was still the norm for families to be confined to a single room, these policies resulted in all citizens having access to very high living standards. To achieve this, it was not only essential to support tenants, but also to avoid building different grades of accommodation, namely first and second class housing. To that extent, the new national housing policy strategically prioritized public companies in the distribution of housing loans. In particular, the municipal housing companies whose final objective was service provision rather than profits. In this way, while the access of families to housing was guaranteed, regardless of income, house building and management speculation could be eliminated. Housing cooperatives and private companies also had access to public loans. However, conditions were less favorable. The aim of prioritizing public agencies was to strengthen the public sector by growing the municipal housing companies and regulating market prices, previously dominated by the private sector. The regulation of access to loans was also key for the implementation of this third element of the national strategy. House building public loans were substantial enough for the state to demand high standards. In other words, housing built with national loans had to be of good quality, regardless of who would live in these dwellings, or whether these dwellings were built by municipal companies, the private sector, or cooperatives. These were not new conceptions. At the end of the First World War, the different answers given by architects to the housing question succeeded and overlapped one another, forming a continuous line that determined the future of housing in Sweden for over half a century. Research led by the Committee of Standardiseringskomité Committee and Bostadssociale Utredningen, the housing investigation, in the 20s and 30s was complemented by other sources of knowledge, such as the work developed by housing cooperatives and women's organizations. The importance of both of these groups cannot be underestimated, particularly the central role they played in institutionalizing housing research. In 1944, thanks to the pressure exerted by women's associations, such as Social Democratic Women in Sweden, the state-funded National Research Institute, HFI, Home Research Institute, was funded. Its research was based on previous investigations and rigorously analyzed dwellings, their dimensions, and home-based work processes. As such, the HFI's mission was to define the norms and the standards that would be essential features of new dwellings. 4 years later, in 1948, the State Construction Loans Agency, in existence since 1933, was remodeled to become the National Housing Board. As the body responsible for housing building loans, its aim was to promote house building in Sweden and determine new housing policies. It also established the rules and regulations that had to be complied with, set out in God Bostad, Good Living, a booklet that defined the minimum size of rooms, how they should be furnished, and which features should be incorporated. Good Bostad embedded the two principles which enshrined the significant achievements of housing in Sweden during this period: equality and continuity. It guaranteed equality by defining a single housing standard for all citizens, leading to the eventual disappearance of low-quality housing. It also signaled a commitment to long-term housing research. Published for the first time in 1954 and updated and revised several times until the end of the 70s, this booklet was the result of consolidated experiences and achievements in housing brought about by a process of accumulation and sedimentation of knowledge that started with the first studies in the 20s. The result of this was an inclusive national policy. By the start of the 50s, the housing question in Sweden had been completely institutionalized. Between 1945 and 1960, this triple strategy approved by Parliament was directly responsible for an unprecedented increase in the number of dwellings and an improvement in the quality of housing in Sweden. The system of loans resulted in an extra 700,000 new dwellings built in this period, representing over a third of the total number of units in the country. The old single room and kitchen housing model, the traditional living environment of working class families, gradually disappeared to be replaced by 2 or 3 bedroom apartments in which features such as central heating, bathrooms and fridges, as well as electric or gas cookers, ceased to be an exception and became the norm. Thank you.